I have to preface this by saying I started with a group of artists in Buffalo in an alternative space called Hall Walls. And we got money from the government and some private people to develop a space in Buffalo, New York, which is maybe 8 hours away from New York City. And what we did there is we invited artists up to install work and do installations and things like that, and do lectures and things like that. So it was a gallery, an alternative space, but at the same time we also got to know the artists because they had to come to Buffalo and stay while they install their work. So we worked for many different artists. Richard Serra, John Borowski, Linda Benglis, but there I met Vito. And I became friends with Vito. I really liked his work, and I met Dennis at the time, Dennis Oppenheim at the time. The goal as an artist in America is a lot of times is to move to New York City. I mean, I think it's really important as an artist in America, I think in general, to understand the context in which you want your work to be seen. There are many great technically proficient artists, but a lot of them don't have any idea what the context of their art should be. Because you have this history of art that you had the government sponsoring art, then you had the church sponsoring art, then all of a sudden modern art happened and people had to figure out what they were going to make pictures of. They were free, and most artists the struggle to figure out what they make is really the biggest struggle. And the context is really important, where you want to see your work, what context you want to see your work in. And Hall Walls was a way of establishing content, the very specific kind of art that we were interested in. It was art that came from Avalanche magazine, it came from Art Forum. We were interested in the most cutting edge contemporary art possible. So Cindy Sherman and I lived together in Buffalo, and we moved to New York together in 1977. And when I got to New York, I needed a job. So I called Vito up. I said, I know you need assistance, I've worked with you before, you know me, and he gave me a job right away. So I was working for Vito right away. And it was an interesting experience because as an assistant for an artist, he was doing lots of different things. He was doing installations with sound and fabricating things. So I had to do lots of different things. It wasn't the most traditional studio where I was helping him make his paintings or drawings, but I had to do lots of things for him. And when I was in Buffalo, I worked for a filmmaker, a structuralist filmmaker called Paul Sheretz, where I made his films. He makes Flickr films. I don't know if you've ever seen Paul Sheretz's films. Structuralist filmmaking, I don't know if Russia ever got that. I found out about Eisenstein through this school that was in Buffalo at the university that was about structuralist filmmaking, and Eisenstein was a really important person to these people who were making structuralist films. Structuralist films are like essays on the nature of film. They're non-narrative films. They're about the nature of film. So Sheretz's films were Flickr films. They were like 5 frames of red, 3 frames of blue, 2 frames of yellow. They were like these Flickr films. They were like MTV videos before they actually happened. And I made his films with like an animation stand. He gave me a score on a piece of graph paper. Like he would write 3 frames of yellow. So I'd have to find the yellow piece of paper that matched that, and I would have to go. So I did that for maybe 2 years making his film. So working for artists was pretty natural for me. I mean, it seemed the best way to learn, about being an artist, for sure. Well, what was happening is the work got more and more complicated technically. Ironically, Vito became an architect. So, I mean, that kind of says what I'm talking about. So Vito would have to do more and more complicated installations with the sound installation, physical things. So he had this very, very complicated installation at the place called the Clock Tower here in New York, which is literally in a clock tower. And it's 3 different floors, and the top floor is actually the inside of a clock that's on a building, and you can see all the machines and gears, and there's a broken glass where the clock is. So Vito had this idea, he wanted this tight cable to go through these 3 floors, like opening windows and going up the stairs and eventually going out the window. And on this cable were these boxes that had speakers in them. So we had to run. So it was, and when it went outside the window, it was connected to a 100-pound ball. And so it looks like that's what's keeping it taut, but that's not really what's keeping it taut. So I needed to assemble a group of guys to help me do it. And the guys that I knew in New York were my friends who were other artists.
Who were like Troy
and Jack Goldstein and David Sally. And it was like, I mean, these guys don't know how to do anything technical. They're like, it was like hiring the Three Stooges, you know. It was hiring like at that point, I realized that we really didn't know what we were doing. And at one point, I had to learn how to use all these come-alongs, things that make the wire tight. And we were afraid of getting, one time Jack got whipped in the neck by the cable. And so anyway, at one point we were lowering the ball outside the window. And we're not wearing, I think only one of us was wearing gloves. It's really heavy. And David says to me, like, you know, this is not connected to anything as we're looking out the window. It was really like a comedy. So, I mean, at that point, I mean, I remember saying to Vito, you know, you need real technical people. You need like architects and, you know, construction workers to help you. You shouldn't be hiring artists. It's crazy. But the thing is also interesting is Vito set a model for me of how I didn't want to be as an artist when I hired people. Vito didn't really help any of us. He was kind of curious about what we were doing, and we all became very aware that if we showed Vito our work, he would probably rip us off. He was like this guy who was always looking for he always wanted to know what the newest music we were listening to, what clubs we were going to. We used to joke about how we can't tell Vito stuff because he's going to rip us off, you know. So, and the thing is also, as an artist who employs young artists, I say to them, I know when you go out and drink at night, you're making fun of me. You know, I mean, I know that. I did that. We would go out afterwards working for Vito, we would talk about how Vito was fucking up, how Vito always would be he'd work up to the very last day of the show and things won't be ready. So we would always joke about that. But
what was the last time you talked to him?
I saw him maybe a year ago. Actually, I saw him at Dennis Oppenheim's funeral. Dennis was different. Dennis was much more, when I worked for Dennis, he was much more easygoing about things. But I didn't do much. I mean, I worked on some drawings for him. I helped organize stuff for him, but not, Vito, I was really in it. I was really in it for a long time. I mean, we built a piece that there was a table that went outside the window, like a diving board, and
where was that?
at Sonnabend on West Broadway here in the city, and it had speakers hanging over it with these people talking who's supposed to be sitting around the table, and then you hear these footsteps, and then you hear them jumping. The idea that they were getting on the table and running out the window and jumping, because the table went out the window like a diving board. But when we installed the piece, we didn't counterweight it, so the table started going out the window. We didn't put a weight on the other side of it. So that was another occasion was saying, Vito, you need like real people to help you build. So it's ironic that Vito became an architect. So now he has real people working for him. When Cindy and I moved here, you know, working for Vito was okay, but what happened was I was supposed to do a show at the Kitchen. That was one of the reasons we moved to New York. I did this picture show, and I was also going to do this performance at the Kitchen and a show. The curator there, her name was Carlotta Schoolman. She said to me, "Look, Robert, I know that you did hall walls, and you have experience doing shows and exhibitions and performances. I want to go away for like 4 months to India so would you take my job, run everything? I said, I don't want to be a curator. I don't want to make decisions about artists. I'm done with that. Because I realized at one point in Buffalo, when I would come to New York, people were hustling me, artists were hustling me to try to get gigs in Buffalo. Do you know what I mean? You know what that's like, right?
I know.
It's like all of a sudden you become paranoid that why are people becoming friends with you because they want something from you. You know, New York curators are so fucked up that they basically almost don't have any contact with artists there because they're terrified of artists because artists are always wanting shit from them. So I didn't want to do that anymore. So she said, no, 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 you don't have to do anything. The schedule's all set. Everything's fine. You just have to do it. I said, great. There's some money. I remember going home and telling Cindy, we have some money. We have a job. I remember telling my father that I had a job finally. And my father was like, I told him that I had a job working at the kitchen. My father got really upset. He said, so wait, you went to 4 years of art school, now you're working in a kitchen? Are you like a chef or something? Like what the fuck are you doing? It was like, I said, forget it. Anyway, so I worked at the kitchen and I met, the thing is again about this idea of context. It's like coming in contact with other artists is a really important thing to have this kind of like community and dialogue. So I got to know a lot of the people in New York through the kitchen and make a long story short, Carlotta got sick in India and she couldn't come back. So she said, you know, can you fill in for me till I get back? And I said, wow. But then I realized, wow, this is the chance to get all my friends exhibitions and performances at the kitchen. So I started to like, you know, David Sally did something and Jack Golston did something, Cindy did something, Troy did something. So I started to put bands and things. And at the same time in the kitchen, the director of the kitchen was leaving. And it didn't have a director anymore. And I was one of the curators for like video and performance and the gallery. And then there was somebody who was doing music, Reese Chatham, and Eric Bogosian was doing the music. And we were all wanted to do our own stuff. We were all the same generation. And all of a sudden, we were in control of the kitchen. So it was like, do you know the expression, the inmates are running the mental institution? It was like the prisoners were running the prison. So all of a sudden, we started to program stuff in conjunction with each other. Like Reese was interested in punk music. All of a sudden, the Talking Heads were playing there. Theoretical Girls were playing there. So we helped usher in a next generation. Because the kitchen was really famous for doing Robert Wilson and Phil Glass and Laurie Anderson, things like that. So we helped bring in that next generation of artists there. So that was really important. My first studio, when Cindy and I moved to New York, we sublet Troy's Brontock's apartment, which was way downtown on Fulton Street. And then when he came back in September, because we moved here in like, I guess May or something like that, 77, we found a studio literally around the corner on South Street and John Street, way down by the South Street Seaport, because we couldn't afford living in Soho. Brooklyn didn't exist then.
Yeah,
it didn't exist. Like
it existed, but it was
not real.
Peter wasn't in Brooklyn, you said.
He hadn't moved there yet. Brooklyn was like, moving to Brooklyn meant that you, at that point, as an artist, meant that you had really failed. Like you were giving up. You know, so here I am on South Street and John Street, literally across the river from Brooklyn. You could see Brooklyn from my window, but I wasn't going to go to Brooklyn. Then I remember Vito telling me he got this big studio there and how he was going like, I don't know if you know Vito, he's very self-deprecating. He's like, oh, I know everyone's going to think I failed. I've been living in Brooklyn. But he had this big space, it was amazing. And then Jack moved to Brooklyn. But it's still, they were still like nowhere. It was like they were in these buildings, there was nothing around them. It just didn't seem, being in New York, you still felt like you were around your friends and the atmosphere was really pretty vital at the time. So when Cindy and I moved to South Street and John Street, we had a studio there that didn't cost very much money, but after the first 2 years we were there, or a year or so we were there, the building was was shut down, we had to sneak in. It was a vacate order. They turned off all the electricity and things like that, and we had to sneak into the building to live in the building. We had no electricity. We got electricity from the building next door. We had no heat and things like that. So.
When did you move to this studio?
I moved here in 1984, and I used to live in the office. What's the office? So.
You live in there.
I don't live there anymore. That's where the office is. So 1984. So I've been here since 1984. But I was the first one in my group to actually be able to have some money to move to a bigger studio, which is funny because I moved from South Street closer to Soho, which is kind of strange. What was interesting, the idea of working for Vito is one thing, which is, it seemed like it made sense within the tradition of artists working for artists. But there was a different thing happening with Jack Goldstein and Troy Brontak. And Jack Goldstein was, when he came to Buffalo to show his films, I said, why don't we edit them all together onto one reel and we can see them? And Jack said, I don't know how to do that. I said, what do you mean? He says, I don't know how to make films. I said, how do you make films? He said, I hire people to help me make the films. Or Troy, how do you make those photographs? No, I hire someone to make the photo. All of a sudden, this idea of hiring people to help you do your work was introduced. And that was really pretty radical to me. So what happened is when my work started to get more complicated and bigger, I was never really interested in the craft of things, of the craftsmanship of something. I was much more interested in getting the work done. And I hated how long it took for me to make something. So at that time, I met at a party, a friend of mine, I met this woman named Diane Shea, who was a professional illustrator. Around that time, so I said, look, I need someone to help me finish these drawings, because I just started doing the Men in the Cities drawings. So making one drawing would take me 2 months to make, but I was really interested in making 3 drawings because I wanted them to be triptychs or things like that. So I said, are you really good at hair and the folds and shirts and things like that? She said, yeah, it's a piece of cake. So she came to work for me. She still works for me. But the thing is that it helped speed things up to make the work, because I really didn't fucking care about the techniques. I mean, I knew how I wanted the work to look, and I could tell her, she became another tool. I knew that Diane was really good at hair, she was really good at the folds of a shirt, so I knew what I could use her for. So I was still involved in making the work and drawing, but at the same time, the drawings were going faster. But the other thing I realized is that I realized really early on, this is a really important thing for me, I really early on that I had this incredible love of my own hand. So if I could make something the way I wanted it, it would be this incredible feeling. And I realized I wasn't critical of my own hand. I was very reluctant to go change something because it kind of looks good, but it could be better. What's interesting with assistants, I can go in and erase a whole section of a work that looks great. Somebody would say, what's wrong with it? And I know something's wrong with it, but I can go in and just change the whole thing. You see what I'm saying? And I don't feel like, it's easier for me to be critical. But my own hand, I found myself being incredibly narcissistic about my own actions. And I couldn't be critical of it. But with my guys have come to realize that when I go in and erase a whole section of a piece that they're working on and say, no, this is wrong. Anyway. What started happening is I started to sell the work. And I had more ambitious ideas of how I wanted to make the work. And I wanted to make it bigger, more complicated. And I started to work with a foundry, making some sculptures. So that was the beginning of expanding. But the foundry was someplace else. But I didn't want to just do these kind of traditional sculptures. I wanted to build these buildings and reliefs. And I also wanted to make bigger constructions and bigger drawings. So Jim Shepard, who still works with me today, he started working with me then, and he was a painter. So through him, he knew how to stretch canvas really well, and it started to grow. And through him, I started to meet some younger artists. What's always happened is my work has been the advertising to get people to work for me. So all of a sudden, the younger artists who'd seen my show wanted to ask me, is there any possibility to get a job? So I said, so at that point, the studio started to expand. It went from Jim to Rick to Mike. It got maybe at one point, there's maybe like 6 or 8 people. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. And the problem that was started to happen is, and I was making more and more money, so I was taking all that money that I was making and putting it back into the work. I was very belligerent about what I was making. My gallery was saying, you're making things too big, they'll never sell. And my attitude was like, fuck that, people will buy it. They'll have to put walls over the windows in their house. I was very egotistical. I was totally out of control. And eventually, I got to the point with the work where I was less and less involved in the work. I was more directing it. And the work started to have its problems. And what happened was, at the same time, I think what happened is the art world kind of, at my generation, you have to realize that there's a really weird cycle of stuff that happens here. Is when people criticize the art world about money, see, I'm making money now, mid-'80s, early mid-'80s, I'm making money, and I'm making, a lot of my contemporaries like Schnabel and Sally, and they're all making lots of money. I'm putting most of my money back into my work. I don't buy my house in the Hamptons, I'm not collecting my Russell Wright china. I mean, I'm putting most of my work back into my work, but what was happening is when they look back historically, when people criticize the art world for the money in the art world, they go back to my generation like it's the original sin. We're the ones that we first started making money. But the money that we made in the beginning of the 80s is nothing compared to what happened with Koons in the beginning of the 90s. So what happened is my generation, as much as my generation was a replacement generation for Vito's generation, this next kind of sub-generation with like Neo Geo and Koons and those people that came around in the late 80s basically kind of created the end of my generation. That the 80s were kind of over. So I was one of the guys that was kind of blamed for the 80s. Me, Schnabel, Sally, we became like pariahs in a weird way, And the art world kind of I remember the end of the 80s, the last show I did in New York, I usually would pretty much sell everything I made, but all of a sudden people had put reserves on work, and then all of a sudden very few pieces were selling. And money became a difficult thing because I hadn't really saved that much of it. I was always putting it back in the work. And I realized, I'm in trouble. And that's when I left New York. I moved back to New York in 1992, 93 from Paris. I had no assistants, and I did this series of Magellan. And my friend Troy Brontuck was teaching, and John Kessler were teaching at Columbia. And I said, you know what, I think I have a little money, just a little money now. I've been selling some things here and there. I need a few assistants part-time. Do you have any young artists there working at the school, at the Columbia Grad School, who you think are interesting? He says, yeah, I have these 2 guys, Eric Schnell and Colin. And they were great. Because in a weird way, it was like, I wasn't that much older than them, but I was a functioning artist and they were still students. And Eric was a bit of a star at that point. He was like, and they came to work for me, and I was just trying to develop what I was doing, but they did all sorts of different things for me. Colin helped hang art in my house. Eric was trying to organize Eric tried to do the office work, which was totally ridiculous. He was terrible at it, but they were great to talk to. They were really vital and exciting to talk to. And then what happened is one Christmas I wanted to get away from my family because they were all home from vacation, and I wanted to do some drawings, and I couldn't do any drawings, and because I didn't have graphite pencils, and I had some charcoal, and I hate charcoal, and I took some paper out that I usually use for everything else, and make a long story short, I took one of my son's surfing magazines, and I started doing this first wave drawing. And this first wave drawing, I basically stayed in the studio during that Christmas vacation working on this wave drawing by myself, and I had this breakthrough with the charcoal, which I hated. And all of a sudden I realized I could do this thing with, and it kind of, from there, when Colin came back to work after the vacation, I said, you know what, I want to show you what I'm doing. Have you ever drawn? He's a painter. Have you ever drawn? Do you know how to use this stuff? He says, no. This is how I'm doing it. Help me finish this drawing, this new drawing. So Colin started to work with me to develop this technique with the charcoal. And from there, it kind of exploded.
It was in 1999, right? The way.
Yeah, 1999, exactly. And from there, but Colin was working for me before that, like in '98 or something like that. And I had him doing all sorts of crazy painting stuff, and we did all sorts of different stupid I had all these projects planned that I basically shelved once I realized the drawings would work. What's really interesting is that, in hindsight, I don't know if this is important, but when I did the picture show in 1977, I was playing in bands, I was doing performance pieces, and I was doing drawings and all these different. And what I showed in the picture as a show were 4 reliefs, but there was one relief of this man being shot from the Fassbinder film. That piece seemed to get a lot of attention. And that made me, I remember reading this really great interview with Canellis about how you should work towards affection. If people say they like that more than they like that, you should listen to them. And at that point, I realized I should investigate that. So all the other stuff, the bands, the films, the videos, the performance, everything else I put away, and I concentrated on that. That's exactly what happened with the charcoal. Now I'm talking to you about it. It's exactly what happened with the charcoal stuff. I was working on paintings. I had this film project I wanted to work on. I basically put everything away and said, this is what I'm going to do. And at the same time, I had always had this fascination with these photographs from Freud's apartment. So what happened is we started to draw details of these photographs from Freud's apartment, and we did the waves and Freud at the same time. So it was Colin and I basically, at that time, doing.
Eric left?
Eric, yeah, left. Eric went to Texas, and it was Colin and I at that point working, and I realized I had seen Koons. I think I did the first show of the waves. And I think we sold like 1 wave. It wasn't such a great success, you know. And I remember all of a sudden I started getting, the show wasn't a financial success, but it seemed to have some critical success, and people were interested, and I started getting invited back to schools to do talks again, which I hadn't done in years. And I had gotten to the point when I was really successful in the 80s that I got so snotty that I didn't even want to do talks anymore. And then somehow I had talked to Koons right around that time, and I was talking about how I wanted to get assistants, new assistants. And I said, where do you find them? He says, the best place to find assistants is the Rhode Island School of Design, RISD. He says, that's where the best assistants come from. And I had just gotten an invitation from RISD to go talk there. So I had made this schedule of doing talks, about 3 or 4 talks in a row, and the last one was RISD. So I kind of went on the road for a little bit talking about my work, and the last place was RISD. And at the end of the show, at the end of my lecture at RISD, I said, if there's anybody, I'm looking for assistance. I said, Koons tells me they're really good, you're really good. I'm looking for assistance, and if any of you are moving to New York, look me up. And that's how Jason happened. And yeah, and Jason, I think what happened first is Jason came. I don't know the order, but you realize from RISD is Jason, Julio, Bill, and they brought in Alex. The thing about the RISD graduate program, see, at the same time Columbia, where Colin came out of, had John Kessler and had really helped change the graduate program there. So they focused the context of what the graduate program was. It used to be a graduate program with all these different kind of artists, but he focused the context of it. He made much more cutting edge contemporary art. And the graduate students that were at Columbia were pretty great. And Colin is from Columbia, Eric is from Columbia, and Brock is from Columbia. And when I was up at Columbia, I had heard about Brock. Like, everyone says, he's this crazy fucker. He's, it was this crazy guy. But I met Brock. So what happened is those guys, as the work got more and more complicated and demands of work increased, I needed more people. So it started getting bigger. So it went from Jason and Julio and Bill. We needed to add somebody else. And so Jim's not working for me anymore. So there's those three guys are working for me, and Colin. And then we needed somebody to do some work around the studio, to build stuff. We needed tables and things like that. So Paolo, who started to work in the office, said his childhood friend lives in New York and he's really good with building things. His name is Brock. And he's really, really good. And he also can draw and stuff like that, but we basically hired him to build, he built like that table over there. We basically hired him to do stuff. Brock. And meanwhile, I told John Kessler that I'd hired Brock. And John said, Brock is really crazy. He does this really crazy work. Because he was a graduate student there. And I met Brock, and I saw in Brock me younger. I saw this guy that was just raging to go. And one day I said, can you help us with one of these drawings? And the guy had incredible chops. I mean, the thing is, you have to have a technical ability to work in my studio. And he was fucking amazing. He was great. He was great. But I also started learning about his work, and his art is fucking great. So the thing is, my assistants, my work, I don't think I have any guys working for me that I don't like what they do. I mean, I think it would be really, it's interesting because there was a guy I wanted to hire, but I really hated the work he made. And he had skill, but I just thought the work was terrible. And I just didn't think I could be able to communicate with him. So most of the guys that work for me, I admire what they're trying to do. I think it's the struggle. This goes back to Vito. So I said to myself, okay, now I'm making some money, I can hire people. I say to myself, okay, if I'm going to hire people and having them help me make my work, I want to create an atmosphere where they're paid really well, where they have enough time to do their own work, and that and that I can help them with what they're doing. So maybe I can help curate a show with them. Or Vito, when people from museums and galleries came to the studio, he never introduced any of us. We were just like the help. So I try to make sure that people in the studio here get to know, like Kate, you, things like that. Somehow they're artists. They're acknowledged as artists, because I think within that tradition of artists working for artists, it's very, very old. But I think it's really important that they get, somehow this also becomes a vehicle for them. And at one point, they did something which was really quite amazing. They organized together these groups of shows that they did in a school that were amazing. They were the best shows I'd ever seen of young artists. Unfortunately, they didn't get much attention. And I remember some people criticized me that I pay them too much money because it doesn't give them enough push to go out in the world and do their work, which I think is really fucking ridiculous. It's a job. They have to come here and work for me. They're not in their studios working. So it's not a horrible job, but they don't work full time. They work the most, they work 4 days a week, 11 to 6. But then I was talking to them about it. I said, is this too cushy a situation for you? And Jason said to me, you have no idea what it's like out there. How many thousands of artists there are out there. To have a decent job to where I have time to do work is really great. And so I think that's really important that Vito kind of helped show me how I didn't want to be. It's kind of like how I am as a father. My father was an example of how I didn't want to be. You know?
Okay.
So
you once told me that you want them to be at the level you wanted yourself to be at, like when you were
yeah.
then, right? When you were there.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of, there's well, but it's also very selfish.
Is it?
It's totally selfish. I don't want to fire anybody. I want them to leave. I want them to leave. I don't want to deal with the conflict of firing anybody. I don't like conflict. I either kill people, get in fights, or I survive with things, and you know. But I want them to leave as artists. Like when Colin left under his own terms. He decided it was time for him to leave, and that's what, you know.
Like Ed also.
Yeah, exactly. You know, Ed said, I want to go out and do my own stuff. And then Ed ends up working for Urs Fischer, which makes sense to me. Fine, that's okay too. But the thing is the guys that work for me here, you know, they're also pretty much friends with each other. They support each other. The shows that they did together, there's a core, for me, there's a core of people. And when we started to do God Machines, we needed to bring, so we got more and more professional because it's already going to payroll, health insurance, profit sharing, things like that. But at one point we needed more help to do Mecca. And I didn't really want to hire anybody. I wanted to hire some freelance people. So what I did is, the way that I found these guys from RISD, they told me about their friends. You know, what happened is I said to like Julio, Bill, and Jason, I said, you find guys you trust, or Nathan, that you trust that you can bring into the studio and you can vouch for them. Because I don't want some fucking idiot coming in the studio wrecking the chemistry of the studio. So Julio brought in Edwin, Nathan brought in Yanni, and Bill brought in Brian. And they were great. And what started happening is my work got more and more complicated, bigger and bigger, and I thought maybe I should keep them on. And it just so turns out that Edwin went to the same school as Brock went to. So there seems to be like this universe of like consistency. RISD, Maryland College of Art. But so they stayed, so they were like the new guys in the studio basically. But the core has always been Bill, Jason, and Julio, and Brock, and Colin. And Colin I still talk to every now and then. Sometimes we had to do a drawing that was similar to something we did a long time ago. And I said, you know, stop by the studio, let's talk about it, you know. But at the same time, I think the other thing is I own a lot of my assistants' work. I made the mistake that I didn't buy enough of my own generation's work. Like I have a bunch of Cindy's photographs. I have a bunch of Troy's work. I only have a few pieces of Jack. I have maybe something by David, Sally, Matt Mulliken, but I should have bought more of those guys' work when it was really young. But so these guys in the studio, I have a bunch of Brock's pieces, I have a bunch of Bill's pieces, I have a bunch of Julio's, I have a bunch of Jason's. So if one of them gets really successful, I'm gonna look really smart.
They will. Do you want to talk about someone about them in particular? I'm not sure if you, because that was like the additional question.
Yeah.
Like I can give you the list and you can just.
I mean, they all have stories with them. I mean, if you ask me one, start.
I don't know, like Corey. But Corey came like.
Well, Corey's really interesting. Corey's really new.
Yeah,
He's really new. I'd known about Corey for a while because at one point I wanted someone, so we've taken in a couple of people that were friends of friends that really weren't really ready to be here. Miles and Kip. They weren't really at the level I wanted, but we needed them to do bullshit around the studio. We needed like cleaning up the studio, making sure all the charcoal. We needed like low-level stuff. And those guys, usually what we did with guys who came to work for me, we gave them a test. It was like a cold test. I gave them a photograph, and I gave them a piece of paper, and I said, draw that. Don't project it, just do it. And a lot of people failed. Those two guys I never gave a test to because they came as friends of Bernice in the office, and they were young guys, and so they never had tests. Their skill level, I didn't really know. So what's happened is their skill level has been basically educated by the other guys in the studio. So they're not my sharpest blades, but they're really important to me. At one point, we needed somebody with really good chops, really can do the work. And Edwin said, there's this friend of mine who's just absolutely miserable who works for Murakami. He works like, 50 hours a week. It's hard. Ivani. And when I met Ivani looked like he'd been fried and like smoke was coming out of his ears. And I said, you want to try working for me? So that's how Ivani started working for me. So I'd always ask Ivani how horrible it was to work for Murakami to make me feel good, But then I needed the work got bigger and more complicated, and the other thing is, what started to happen is the guys, my upper guys, like Bill and Brock, and Julio, they wanted to work less. They were making enough money, they could work less. Bill sometimes works 2 days a week, Brock sometimes works 2 days a week, sometimes doesn't work, sometimes they don't work for a couple of weeks. So I want to give them that possibilities, but I need to have someone that has they're close to the skill level. So that's why Ivani came in. And then, Bill started to cut down more and more, and Brock moved upstate, Colin was gone, and we needed another really good skill level person. So Ivani said that he knows a guy who's really burnt out, who's working for Coons, and he really wants to get out of it. And that's where Corey came from. So Corey, we asked him to tell us stories about Coons, which is really, he tells us stories about Coons. I want to imagine that my studio is the most perfect place in the world, but I know it's not. I mean, what's interesting is by keeping the situation as loose as it is, that when we have crunch time, I don't feel bad about putting my foot down saying, you have to work 40 hours this week. You have to work 40 hours. I know. So in that sense, I push it, but that flexibility is really important to give the guys who work here flexibility. But, the office is a whole other different thing, but Paolo is really vital because Paolo helps organize everything. And watching Paolo develop as an artist is really interesting because this recent stuff that he's doing, I know he's had a gallery and he's been showing stuff, but it was always a little close to my work, like drawings and things like that. And he tried some installations which were kind of cool, but this new stuff he's doing now, I think is really interesting, and it has no connections to what I do at all. But the other thing by having guys that you respect that work for you, you can ask their opinions of things. I mean, I realize I'm paying them, so they're never giving me the most honest opinions. I try to encourage them to say,
No? You think no?
you know what? They're the ones that I know will be the most. Julio is like the wise man here. Bill, Brock, they're all giving me. They're also the ones like. There is a hierarchy for me. They're my there are my masters, and then they're mid-range, and they're workers, but for sure. But they have all different levels, but they're all interesting as they're developing as artists, for sure. I mean, Brock shouldn't be working here. Bill shouldn't be working. Julio shouldn't be working here. Probably Jason shouldn't be working here. But you know, the problem is there were just so many fucking artists out there. It's ridiculous, you know. But I mean, that's the situation that is. I mean, it's. I don't know how to explain it, but I mean, I wish. The other thing is, working for an artist isn't not necessarily the key to getting your work out into the world. You know, there are a few artists but you know, like something like you're doing is great. So.
Like, I mean, once you also said that like you were creating like circumstances for yourself to get luck, like to get luck. It's not like you're just lucky. Like,
yeah, absolutely. That was that's like when younger artists always ask you the question like, how did you do it? How did you become successful? It's like you don't sit at home in your loft painting and hope to be discovered. You have to create a situation where luck is a really big part of it. You have to have talent and you have to have work ethic and things like that. But you have to create a situation. Luck will find you but you have to create as many possibilities for it to find your address. It's like saying, how is Santa going to find me? You know what I mean? So you have to create a situation where you make a net, where there's a greater chance of catching luck. And that is by having a community of artists, by having friends and having spread the word around. It's like having a community is a really important thing. Being isolated is fucking useless. You'll just disappear. Because they know they should be out in the world. They should be ready to go. I mean, Brock is a perfect example of it. I mean, I don't think he would prefer to people that know that he doesn't work for me. I think Edwin working for Urs Fischer is, in his mind, a career move, because Urs Fischer is younger, you know, is younger world. Urs Fischer, the way he works is very different from me, and Ed fits more Urs's sensibility, and I think that makes sense to me. It makes more sense to me. I think that makes more sense to me that he does that, and Urs's stuff is like he does all this different stuff. I mean, I think he's a really good artist. I have no problems with that. But I'm not so interested in what he's doing. I mean, it's all over the place. It's almost like, there are those children of Kippenberger. He's one of those guys. It's like he can do lots of different things. I don't particularly care about that stuff. And I think for Edwin, he fits perfectly. Where I think a lot of the other guys here, they're more focused on an agenda that's different. I mean, I think Brock is really, Julio is somebody now who I think is incredibly talented. He's really struggling to figure out what he's doing. Bill thinks he knows what he's doing, which is he's putting all his eggs in one basket, which is, I guess, the thing to do at this point now. I don't know if they're the right eggs, but I mean, I own a bunch I love some of his paintings. I think they're really, I bought some of Q's work before he worked for me. Yeah, so I'm in a graduate show at Columbia. He was really great. He was like a young star at that point. But the problem is, there are so many young artists. So he had a lot of buzz around him, just as Brock did, just as Garrick did. Eric was like the next superstar. But the thing is that the market didn't, they had critical support. They didn't have market support, which is really the fucked up thing.
So, can you tell me a few thoughts about the show that I'm curating for them?
Well, I did a show like this a couple of years ago, and I did a show like that. I've done maybe 3 or 4 of these kind of shows with my assistants. I think one show was called Fictive Victims. It was in Buffalo at the old alternative space. I think it's great that you're doing it and not me. And that you're looking at them as artists. And the thing that they do have in common is this, like, they've come together in my universe. That's it. That's the only thing they haven't. But what's interesting is that by meeting here in the studio, they've found common ground. They've become friends. They hang out together. They did these incredible shows together. I mean, I wish you could have seen those shows. It was amazing. They were 2 shows that were so great.
In the church, right?
In the church, it was in the church. The other, they were both in, they weren't in churches. They were in where the nuns lived, the nunnery. It was in the house where the nuns lived. And the other one was in the house where the monks, the men lived. And they were incredible. You should try to find those pictures. And they all had to work together.
There's websites.
Yeah, they were really, I think those shows were really great. They were really great. And most of the guys that were in it, you know. Owen, we should try to find him. Owen is the only person that left for health reasons.
For what?
Health reasons, he was sick. And Yanni left because he decided to go off and start a marijuana business in California.